You know, God uses pains and suffering for His purposes. I'm reminded of a number of instances, true stories here. Between her firstborn and her secondborn, there were 4 miscarriages. Meg and I have been through some as well. We know the pain of that loss. It hurts. It cuts deep. But she had an opportunity a few years later to minister to someone, to talk with a young lady who'd gone through a miscarriage. Because of the evil, the misfortune that she had experienced, she's been able to help other people through it. Reminded of the old married couple. They were old. They were old to me. They really weren't that old. I remember they watched their son die slowly to a disease they could do nothing to stop. How can good come from something like that? I can tell you, they've been able to minister to people who've experienced loss in a terrible way. They know what it's like. And souls have been reached because of that loss. In Oklahoma, we have a special place in our hearts for a place called the Murrow Building in Oklahoma City. If you don't know, a bomb was set off at this federal building, killing a good number of people. Someone I know was not there, but he's a counselor, and he walked the rubble. He talked to the firefighters, the responders that dug out people and parts. When 9/11 happened, believe it or not, one of the places that they wanted to get firefighters and counselors from was Oklahoma, because we'd seen it. And when he returned, he told a number of stories about how when he walked out onto the rubble, it was still hot. Some of them, they had to be careful where they walked because their boots would melt if they weren't careful. Because of what he'd seen in one terrible setting, he was able to minister in another and to reach people. You know, God specializes in taking the pain caused by sin and evil, and somehow He redeems it and He transforms it into something that can be used for good. And God does that all the time. Of course, first and foremost, His death upon the cross. The Apostle Paul would say to us in Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 28, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him and have been called according to His purpose." We're going to just stop right there. You can read the rest up there for context, but just for tonight, we know that when evil things happen to us, when storms come, we ought to know that God can somehow redeem this for good. No matter what comes your way. Now, this does not mean that God is excited when evil happens to you. This does not mean that even though because of some past sin or transgression, God is happy about that, God can redeem that as well and use it for His purposes. It doesn't mean we have license to go and live however we want, but it does mean that out of the mess of our lives, God can use that. Not just can use it, but frequently does use it to tremendous effect. Tonight, as we think together the story of Genesis chapter 37, we pick up the story of Joseph. You know, if you read the story of Joseph, there's one word that kind of comes to my mind with Joseph, or an idea anyway: snake bit. It seems like every time things get going good with Joseph, something bad happens. And not just like kind of bad, but like the world is changed sort of disaster. Genesis chapter 37, verses 23 and following. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, of many colors that he wore, and they took him. They threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. They sat down to eat. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother. Let's sell him." And so the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew up, lifted Joseph out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Now, thankfully, I've never been sold as a slave. Thankfully, my brother has never had the power to carry out any plots to murder me. But I imagine that if I had been sold as a slave, my life would be completely turned upside down. I can think of few things that would be nearly as awful as experiencing what Joseph experienced here. I mean, there might be a few things here and there, but I would think of this as life-changing event negative number one. And of course, many of us know the story of Joseph, and so it's very easy for us. We jump ahead and go, yeah, I know it's bad right now, but in 13 years, it's going to turn out okay. Have you ever been in the midst of a struggle, and someone comes along and says, I know it's bad right now, but in 10 years, you're going to be fine. You know what I'd say to that person? Thanks, but no thanks. That is not helpful right now. Right? I know it might be, we might know it's going to be better in the future, but it doesn't help right now. And yet, somehow, God is going to use attempted fratricide, or almost fratricide, and selling off of the brother. Somehow, God can redeem that. You know, if this was it, this is pretty bad. But more bad stuff happens to Joseph, right? Remember, he's snake bit. You see, Joseph gets thrown in prison for doing the exact right thing. You know, it's bad enough when you get punished for doing wrong, right? How much worse is it when you get punished for doing the right thing? Genesis chapter 39. One day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the other men of the house were there, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But Joseph left his garment in her hand, and he fled, and he got out of the house. As soon as she saw that he had fled and left his garment in her hand, and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried. As soon as he heard it, that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." She laid up his garment by her until his master came home. She told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you sold to us," the same story here. "But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." As soon as the master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. Joseph's master took him out, put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Parents, you ever accidentally punish your child even though they're not the ones that did it? Right? I don't think this has quite happened to me yet, where I've done an accidental punishment. You know, where I spanked William or grounded him or actually done anything. I don't know that I've actually done that yet. The truth is, it'll probably happen, right? I'm a human being. I make mistakes. Can you imagine being that child where you get punished and you know you did nothing wrong? What do you usually? Hey, this isn't fair. This isn't right. You can't do this to me. That's where Joseph is at, except worse. He's not getting spanked. He's getting sent to prison for life. The truth is, he's kind of fortunate just to be sent to prison. Who knows what else might have happened to him. All because he did what was right. Can it get worse? Well, in its own way, it kind of does. You see, later on, as Joseph interprets some dreams for some people, and one of them gets out of prison, the evil that happens to Joseph is he thinks he's going to get an audience to Pharaoh, and he's maybe even going to get out of prison, and he doesn't. Genesis chapter 40, verse 20, down to chapter 41. On the third day, when it was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants, restored the chief cupbearer to his position, placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. If you go into chapter 41, you find out it's for 2 years. You ever do something nice for someone? You go out of your way to help someone, and you make a big difference, and you go, I think I made a big impact on this person today. And then they turn around and they don't even say thank you. Here Joseph is. He has done this incredible thing in telling these dreams and relieving a lot of the stress and the angst that is on this chief cupbearer. Joseph did an awesome thing for this guy, and he forgets about him. Or maybe worse still, he just doesn't care. I don't think that's quite the case, because he does eventually seem to remember Joseph. And for 2 years, 2 more years, Joseph languishes in prison. I hope nobody experiences the kind of suffering that Joseph went through. But it does happen in its own ways, in its own time and places. And of course, for us, those of us that we know the rest of the story, we know that Joseph's brothers, they show up in Egypt, and there's eventually a big family reunion. Of course, there's some ups and downs with that as well. Fantastic read. But eventually the family is reunited. They come together. They live in Egypt for a long period of time. At the end of Genesis chapter 50, if you were to ask me my favorite passage in the book of Genesis, it's up there on the screen for you. In fact, to be honest with you, I actually think it sums up the book of Genesis pretty accurately. Let's read the whole section. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for the evil that we did to him." Let's stop right there. They're probably, if Joseph is nearly any other person, they're probably not wrong. But thankfully, Joseph has been able to see and understand something that they haven't quite grasped yet. Verse 16. And so they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of his servants, of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke this to him. His brothers came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, or you intended evil against me. But God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. I want you to put yourselves in Joseph's shoes for a moment, sandals, and to think about what kind of faith it would take to utter those words to family members who at one point in their lives weighed whether or not just to kill you straight out or to sell you to a fate worse than death. And because of what they did to you, you spent years of your life as a slave, and then even worse, if there is such a thing, in prison. And you can look at them and say, don't fear. I know you did evil to me. They know it too. That's why they're coming. That's why they're bowing down. What you did to harm me, God transformed. He took it and He used it to save life. What can we learn from Joseph? First off, number one, God allows evil and misfortune to happen to us. There might not be a better person in Scripture than Joseph, save, of course, for Jesus Christ. He is fantastic. But I'm pretty sure I don't want a good portion of his life. God allows for good people to endure suffering. In fact, can we even say that maybe God brings some of it? If Joseph hadn't been here at this time and place, I don't know how history would be changed. I think quite a bit. But God allowed Joseph to endure great harm for a purpose. That's one of the great things about God, that yes, He allows evil to happen to us, but He is able to redeem that evil. One of the ways in which He does it, number two, is God will redeem evil to teach us and prepare us for further life and ministry in Him. The three true stories we started out with, each one of those individuals or families, they experienced heartache. Things that I would not wish on anyone, nor you. Nor would I want them to happen to myself. But because of what they went through and what they struggled with, they've been able to reach out to people that they would never have had any connection with. And then they've been able to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ to them. God uses those things. It's one of the remarkable things about who He is, about how He works and operates. God can use evil for good. A third thing that I want you to pick up on as a main theme that runs throughout the book of Genesis: God gives grace even when evil is done to us, or in the case with some of these other stories here in a moment, done by us. You look at Genesis. Genesis is a story where God interacts with all humanity, and it seems like things get going good for a while, and then, bam, sin, disaster. Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve, right? Garden, things going great, they disobey. And even in the midst of God handing out the now punishments or curses, even as that is being handed out, God gives grace. Removes them from the garden, removes them from temptation and sin in that particular aspect, and He clothes them. In fact, if you read in that particular story, they attempt to clothe themselves prior and then God gives them clothing much more proper. God gives grace. Cain kills his brother Abel. It's pretty terrible, on the list of terrible sins. He's punished. God gives him some grace too with the mark. Some protection. Does he deserve it? No. But God gives grace. Story of Noah, the flood. God wipes out all humanity, except for a few people. Right at the very center, the very heart of the story, Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. It's a phrase that I think we ought to hang on to. God remembered Noah. In the midst of the end of the world, God remembers people. And the remembering there is not just, oh yeah, I forgot about Noah and his family. Oh, I better check in and see how things are going on. It's not the idea of the remembered there. The remembered there is, I am remembering you that I have made covenant with you. I have promised to bring you through, and I will do as such. And God does. You can look at Abraham. Abraham, someone who's a paragon of faith, right? He does all these remarkable things. He makes some pretty big mistakes too. And God redeems him. God specializes in giving grace to us when evil is done to us, and even when evil is done by us. And finally, number 4, God ultimately, as Romans 8 pointed out for us, He's ultimately working for our salvation. Why do evil things happen to people? Because God is working for our salvation. And sometimes God will use pain to get our attention, to wake us up, to get us to turn our lives around. Sometimes God will use that. I tend to think God doesn't like using pain, but He'll use what's necessary. Our God will use a good number of means to work for our salvation. The lesson I want you to get out of tonight, if there's just one point to be made, it's simply put that out of evil, God brings good. Whatever's evil you've gone through in your life, God can redeem. Whatever evil you have caused in your life, God can redeem. Think about how you can capture every thought, every moment, every mistake, that God might be glorified in and through your work. Joseph did that. Let us learn well from him. What you intended me for harm, God intended for good. God intends to do good through you. Let us let Him. Maybe this evening you find yourself akin to Joseph, and you find that you are in the midst of the storm. You need prayers and encouragement from the body of Christ. The invitation is to come. Maybe you find yourself on the better end of things right now, and you're thinking, how can God use me? You want prayers and encouragement to work through that. The body of Christ is here for you, that we might help one another grow in faithfulness and in godly works together. The invitation is to come. Won't you come? As together we stand. As together we sing.